think we have a fair few people in now. I'm sure there'll be more people coming in. Hey, Josie, good to have you. Deb as well. Okay, I think we will probably just get going now and let the others catch up while they come in. So to everyone here already, thank you so much for joining. A quick introduction, I'm Laura, Associate Experience Design Director at Fierce. Really excited to be joined for this event by Ian. I'm going to cover a few of the kind of running points that I've got here, and then I'll hand over to Ian to tell you a bit more about himself. So please use the chat now, tell us where you're coming from, share your thoughts along the way. Also, we love to hear kind of reactions and views as we go along. In terms of the format for this, so we'll be spending about kind of 45 minutes or so in the Zoom together. Any questions you have, pop them into the chat as we go, and we'll just ensure that we spend some time covering them off towards the end. The last sort of 10 to 15 minutes of the time we have together today will be over in the Fearless Slack channel. So that's in channel 2. And Ian's going to be answering some questions there. So please head over there for further insight. I think Baxter will post a link to sign up for anyone that's not in there shortly. So keep an eye on the chat. What else? We are recording. The transcript should be available. We will also share the recording with everyone that signed up within the next sort of week or so. So keep an eye out for that. And then I think I've mentioned it before, but finally, please just stay on mute unless you're popping up at the end to ask a question. And I think that's everything. So let's move swiftly on. Ian, awesome to have you with us. Maybe I can ask you to introduce yourself, share a bit about your background, just tell us why we're here.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. I see some familiar faces in the audience. It's really flattering that you're spending time with us here. So yeah, I'm Ian. I'm currently at Netflix managing a design team called Customer Health. I'm sure I'll reference throughout the conversation and pull inspiration from. Before that, I was at a company called Zendesk, managing a team called Core Services. And then before that, I was at a company called LogMeIn, managing some teams there as well. And I'm currently based in Boston, originally from Boston, moved to San Francisco for a bit, and then came back almost a year ago, which feels wild. But yeah, so currently in Boston and trying to really, test out the boundaries of this remote life. So.
Awesome. Well, I think I know the answer to this question, but it'd be good to kind of share with everyone else just to kind of get us going. So if you could tell us a little bit, why did you get into management? How did you get into management in the first place? Why not stay as an IC?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more common paths is that it kind of just happens a little bit, like it happens pretty organically, which was the case for me, where I was working on a team of maybe 3 or 4 designers, and we were redesigning a big product, and it's a newly formed team. So I kind of like took it on myself to just sort of instill some processes and things I think we were missing to be effective. And throughout the course of that, it kind of evolved into just like a sort of de facto leadership type role, and everybody seemed to embrace it, and it seemed to help make the project go well. And so by the end of it, my manager at the time kind of approached me and was just like, hey, you're basically managing the team. Do you want to just like more formally do that and maybe stop doing as much of the individual contributor work? And I really had enjoyed that stretch. And I think I was already always somewhat interested in getting into management eventually anyway. So it was kind of just a natural transition where the opportunity presented itself, and then I haven't really turned back since. But I think it is like different for a lot of people. The level of intentionality behind it, the level of planning around it, and how those things sort of present themselves. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that too.
No, we'll definitely get in. I think there are definitely some that just fall straight into it, or I guess in my case had like a gentle push into it as well. I think that's another way. But I think for someone maybe that hasn't fallen into it, or someone that doesn't get pushed into it, how do you think there are ways to understand whether management is actually something that you want to do? Are there any opportunities that you think people should be looking out for?
Yeah, definitely. And I do think that's like one of the biggest challenges is like at the end of the day, management is a completely different role, right? And I think the industry, and probably still in a lot of places, I'm probably projecting from a place of like companies that are a little more progressive around career paths and things like that. But I feel like back in the day, it was like the only way up at a certain point was to go into management. And so everyone sort of aspired to that unless they wanted to feel like they were limiting themselves. And I think it leads to a lot of people getting involved for the wrong reasons and probably not being great at it and then being down on that aspect of it. So I think like a really important part is just the intentionality and like the sort of motivations for why you would want to get into it anyway, and making sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, right? And I think again, very different role, and especially with design being such a creative area, I think a lot of people feel like they lose some of the creativity when they move to management. So I think reconciling that and seeing if management still feels like a creative discipline to you is important. So along that same line, to I guess like answer your question, a lot of the time it can be a bit of like a leap, a bit of like a drastic change. So I think if you can find ways to sort of like pilot types of like management roles or kind of more gradually shift into that mindset, it can be really helpful as you make that decision so that you don't kind of veer down the wrong path. I think things like hiring interns and trying to like kind of manage them as a more senior designer is a good way to get that sort of direct kind of like coaching management type experience. There's sort of like shifting what you focus on day to day and trying to get more involved with things like product strategy, maybe talking to other teams more often and seeing how they're doing different things, and maybe taking some of their processes and testing it out. Like these are all things I think are pretty common for managers to do. So if you can start doing that as an IC considering management, it's all the better, so that like you suddenly don't find yourself like in a role that you're like, wow, I really don't like this. What have I done? Do I have to look for a new job now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just finding those small opportunities and actually having a company and working with a line manager or someone that's going to support you on those things, so that you've got the space to go away and explore and say, hey, can I try this? Maybe it's not going to work. I want to potentially revert back, or actually I want to take on more. And how can we find opportunities between the two of us for, like, as a manager myself, if someone came to me, it would be like, how do we work together to give you those opportunities, even if it's in like a project space? How can we carve out some space for you to do that? So I think there has to be that two-edge. So like as a person, you need to be kind of proactive and asking for it, but hopefully you're in probably a space as well that you've got the right people around you that can support you to explore
Right.
that as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. And I think speaks to what a good manager is too, right? Like if you have someone there who can support you and help you navigate that, that's probably the type of manager that you're aspiring to be eventually too. So that's really great. And I hope everyone finds themselves in that type of situation instead of someone who's just unwilling to help you grow.
Yeah. I mean, there was a question, I think, from the Slack community. We put some things out to just to see kind of what people were interested in. And along those lines, I'm sorry, I can't remember who asked it, but someone basically asked if there are any resources that people can sort of lean on to learn some of these techniques, or learn how to be a better manager if they're already in that position or they're looking to move into that position. So maybe that's a good time for us to address that question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I mean, I think the irony is that like if you're in a Slack community asking questions about this, attending a sort of fireside chat about this topic, like congrats, you're already doing it, right? Like give yourself some credit, because you're doing more than I think a lot of people do in terms of like how they really consider this and learn about it. So that's a great start. I think for me, I try to read a lot of articles, podcasts, YouTube videos, like those kind of classic ways, like however you like to ingest content and how it like sticks with you, maybe lean towards that, right? Because there are plenty of really great books too, that you can have as a resource if you're a reader. One that stands out to me that I really enjoy because it's like sort of bite size and daily is the Harvard Business Review has like a newsletter, just that's like management tip of the day. Sometimes it doesn't, it's not the most applicable because it's kind of random, but it's basically them just like distilling down insights from their articles daily and just saying, hey, like here's some stuff to think about as a leader, as a manager. And I think it's a really, again, digestible way to do that, because I think it's easy to get information overload if you listen to me and go, oh man, I have to listen to podcasts and read books and find articles and sign up to newsletters. So I don't mean that. So just find whatever resonates most with you in terms of the type of content, I think.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, it was Alan that asked that question. So thanks, Alan, for the question.
Good question, Alan.
Good question. I think something like if we're talking about transitioning, there's something that we need to kind of touch on, which is management is one path, but there is the IC path as well. I think when we spoke, we were talking about how maybe in your experience, maybe it's the companies you're at, the States versus the UK. It does feel like that is a path that is being carved out a lot more. I think I've been speaking to people kind of over the last month, like last few months, last year, and it feels like it's a hot topic of conversation, having this IC, having this principal route. But actually, when you look at a lot of companies, it's not something that you see. And if there's anything, it's more of this sort of like hybrid role that's kind of coming, that almost is sort of like player coach mentality of like you're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And maybe there are advantages, but I'd love to just understand, do you think there's actually a space for that player coach and for someone to be doing both, or do you think that they're more kind of separate paths are more of the way forward?
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I've actually been thinking about this like since we talked about it last week, because I think you kind of challenged me on one of my thoughts, which again, I think I alluded to this earlier, but I'm coming from a place of like being at pretty established companies with large departments and like pretty progressive approaches to like how we support career tracks. And not everyone is coming from that place. And so it was a good sort of shake up for how I'm thinking about it. And it is challenging, right? And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier of like, it leads people down the wrong path because they feel like it's the only direction they can go, or the only way that they can like, keep moving up a career ladder or whatever. I think, so many thoughts on this, but like one is that I think it is trending in the right direction, right? Like I think as more and more companies adopt like a truly like parallel track of IC and management, it'll show that like this is more effective and it allows you to retain more talented people, and people get really excited about it. And then so other companies that, they'll probably gradually adopt it too. So hopefully change is coming. But I think it's also harder for smaller companies too, because they don't have really large departments that can support hierarchy and tracks, and maybe like, paying a manager and a lead designer about the same is like really tough for them to swallow because of funding or whatever else. So yeah, it's definitely challenging. I don't think there's like any one great answer, but to your question about that sort of like player coach model, I do see that a lot. And I think that it's natural for that to happen when you first move into management. Again, because I think one of the more common paths is that you're an IC at a company, you're doing really well and demonstrating some leadership capabilities. And so that's acknowledged and you're able to like then formally do that. So in an instance like that, you can't just like flip a light switch and go, cool, well, Monday I'm a designer still, and then Tuesday I'm a manager and I'm never touching Figma again. Obviously that can't happen. So you kind of have to think about that gradual transition. Like how do you start, almost either backfilling yourself if you are able to hire for it, or how do you distribute some of the work you were doing across the team in a way that doesn't like strain them? I know that some people do advocate for or like want to do the player coach thing. I was in that mindset when I first tried it, and I just couldn't do it. So like if you have that capability to like basically do two jobs at once, then all the power to you. But I think it should be more of a band-aid than like an ideal approach in most instances, because there's only so many hours in the day, and if you're doing some IC specific responsibility, chances are you're not then doing a management specific responsibility that you would actually really benefit the team by doing. So it's a really challenging one.
No, it really is. And I think especially if you're going to be moving into management, one of the things that you learn is there are a lot of hats to wear. So if you're throwing an IC hat into that as well, yeah, all power to you if you can do that. I'm just having another look through, and I think a lot of the questions that we had from the community ahead of time have been actually around being in the management role. So I'd love to actually move in that direction. So you've kind of decided that management's the path you want to go down. There's now that sort of like, now what, and like all the different kind of considerations and management, the good, the bad, the type of manager that you want to be. So if we could kind of just look at that space. I mean, I might risk losing like half the audience here, but something that I've thought about before, like a bit of a football nerd here, is the link between like football managers and design leaders. You've got like the Peps, the Klopps, and they've all got their sort of like playing style which the team adopts, and you might have this like really high press, and you know that this is kind of what a Liverpool team is, and this is how City plays. And I think some of the things that means is like when you're looking to kind of bring people into it, and I say this as sadly as a United fan, but it's not necessarily just like bring in the big names, the superstars, but actually identify kind of who's going to work within the system and who's going to be the right fit to enhance the team that you're building. And I think I'm going completely down a football tangent, and I could probably spend the rest of my time on it. So just to try and bring it back and like start out wide, I'd love to just get your view on how, as a design leader or a manager, especially someone starting out in that role, how do you start to define your own like style of play? Like, how do you start to think about the leader that you want to be and the team that you want to build?
Yeah, that's great. And I'm now intimidated by the level of knowledge you have for football, and I cannot keep up with the analogies, so I'm not going to go down that route. But that was amazing. So I mean, I think for one, you have to stay true to yourself, right? Like you can't be like, well, I'm super introverted and I am a quiet people person, and so I'm going to read this like one book by the most like extroverted, charismatic person ever and try to mold my leadership style after that. Like you have to stay true to yourself. And if you're getting to a point where some of these opportunities might present themselves and you're naturally evolving into that, it's because of who you are and the path you've taken, not because of like, you know, what you're not on that in terms of that leadership spectrum. So I would lean into your strengths. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, you know, read up on different leadership styles and consider how to be stronger in some areas. And, you know, maybe you've heard feedback about what works well for you and what doesn't. You can build your own learning and development plan around that. But at the end of the day, like you know, everybody should be their own individual type of leader. And, you know, leaning into your strengths is a good thing. I think, what was there? There was another point in there that you had that I wanted to touch on. I guess I'll just stop there, because I think that, you know, there are a few different sort of sub questions from there, but I think that's an important aspect not to lose is, you know, be yourself and be the type of leader that you know is likely already attracting some people to you and getting people to really trust your opinion and expertise on things anyway.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think the value that you're always going to bring is by kind of being yourself and playing to your strengths. And I think there needs to be a kind of acknowledgement of like, where are my gaps as well? And then how do I kind of fill my own gaps, or can I hire, like, is there someone in the team? Where are my gaps? How do I learn? Or do I go to the point you made earlier, like, are there podcasts? Maybe like a podcast isn't going to fill your gap, but how can you start to kind of do your own research to actually understand like how you can become that better manager for yourself and for the team around you as well?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there are a bunch of great resources on just like goals frameworks and, you know, learning and development paths and things like that that you could consider. And, you know, again, like maybe you already are, right? Like I think a lot of the time this ends up being people who are really motivated, really organized, and they already have things like their own set of personal goals frameworks that they apply. And so I think you should just lean into that and be like, all right, well, apply that to your leadership, like how you feel like you're showing up as a leader. you can also talk to other leaders who have maybe been in there more and might have a better view of like what some of the most important skills for leadership are, so that you can kind of populate your list of things that you want to, evaluate yourself on. Maybe you do like a skills wheel that's like really mapping out like the strengths in, all these different areas. But yeah, I think to get back to that point about, I think a lot of people that are interested in this conversation will already have some level of this established on their own. That's actually a good thing to carry forward as you start to try out management and start to coach other people too, right? Like hey, I have this goals framework that has really worked well for me. And now I'm going to try to coach other designers, and let me just copy paste this table over and talk about how I use it, and maybe they can take some of that and use it as well. So you're really just trying to find what works and help expand it to other people too in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think around the kind of topic for new line managers, like another thing that's come up kind of in conversation ahead of the event is actually around like reframing how you're adding value to a project, to a team, to a company, now that you're not in that same sort of like IC role. I think for me, it was around like a shifting mindset of, well, I'm still kind of solving problems, but now I'm solving team problems rather than like user problems, for example. So like that's just it was a switch in my head to go like my success is a team success, and it took a bit of time to kind of get that right. I mean, there's a lot of business problems you have to solve regardless of what role you're in, but I'd love to get a view from you of like reframing value and adding value to a team as well.
Yeah, no, so many feelings about this one. I think it's one of the most like challenging aspects of that transition. I think for me, the light switch moment was kind of framing myself as less of an additive piece of the team and more as like a multiplying factor. Because, just the difference between being an IC, a designer for years and years, where your output is measured by these artifacts you're producing. It's very like tangible. And then just one day you're like, okay, well, I'm not producing any screens and I'm just talking all day to people. And like, maybe I made a presentation last month, but like, it doesn't feel like something you can really wrap your hands around. I think that leads to a lot of people having those moments of like, am I doing the right thing? Am I adding any value to the company? It can be a really like challenging moment. So for me, it was the fact that like managers should be a multiplying force for the team, right? Like your whole job as a manager is to make your team more effective. And so, for example, like if you have 4 people on the team, it's you and 3 other designers, and you're all doing work, you're contributing, 1 design value each, right? But then you shift to a management role and you stop contributing the IC work. You could look at that as like, oh, well, now we're only producing 3 value, whatever this ambiguous design value is. But if you as a manager are doing your job correctly, you're actually, maybe doubling the effectiveness of those people on your team. And so suddenly it's actually, you're producing 6 because you're empowering the team to do their best work, and you're, clearing blockers for them, and you're strengthening the level of critique and the quality of the work and all these things. And it's difficult because a lot of it's invisible, and a lot of it doesn't feel like work after you have been producing things for so long. But I swear it's real work, and I swear it's valuable. You have to trust me here, and try not to go too far down that path of doubting yourself and imposter syndrome and all that, because it's very real and very common, I think.
Absolutely, completely agree. And I think Josie echoes that sentiment as well. I think just kind of staying broad before we kind of go too narrow, just to address another question that we had in. I think it was one from Amy about wanting to know a bit more about communicating between departments as a manager, and how do you keep your team aligned and working well with kind of parallel teams and preventing those silos.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it is like one of the more important things for a manager to focus on too, is the cross-functional relationships, and both understanding other teams' opinions and strategies, and also advocating for designs, and basically taking advantage of that seat at the table that you have in that leadership layer. So for me, it kind of like all starts with building connection with those folks and listening first. So, if you're talking about how do we work better with engineering, like there's been some like conflict about, design's not getting built the right way. And then like design gets left out of like the sort of like Q&A before it goes out, and then it like launches poorly. Though that's just something that you as a manager should be talking to the engineering leader about, right? And say, hey, like I think our process isn't working super well. Like that's your responsibility now to try to guide that forward and to instill some things that will benefit the entire team and the business moving forward. So again, I guess that what I was saying is that like you do need a foundation of trust first to do that, right? Like if you like you're day 3 as a manager and you've barely ever talked to this person, and then something goes wrong and you just like barge into their office and you're like, hey, your team's not building the stuff for my team correctly. Like, obviously that's not going to go well, right? Like you need to really be a human about it. And chances are you're good at that if you've gotten to this point in your career anyway. So really focus on that, go in and say, I only know so much about engineering and why y'all do what you do the way you do it. Tell me more about that. Like, tell me, what you are really excited about this year and why. Do you like focusing on new feature development? Do you like backend refactoring? Are you like a platform thinker? Like whatever, like really get to know them first, and gradually you'll share your own opinions about stuff. And there it becomes clear that like you're all on the same team and you all bring fresh perspectives to the conversation. And I think that's when the most successful teams thrive is, all those different viewpoints are represented and respected across it. So yeah, hopefully that kind of helps, but it's a lot of conversations.
That's awesome. I think something that we kind of say quite often at first is kind of like, how do we help make them successful? Like, how do we learn what they're trying to do and how do we help them get there, so that you've got that buy-in, you're building up that trust, that relationship, but you can also see like, okay, well, they're trying to get over there. So now I can see kind of the motivations behind what they're doing, and I can see how we can kind of play into that and help kind of start building that picture a bit more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually, I was reminded of one other thing when you were saying that, which is, I think Julie Zwo, who used to be like the VP or the head of design at Facebook, I think she had like a tweet once that was saying she's noticed that like the higher up you go in a company, like as the sort of design leader, the less associated with design you actually are. Like the more, I can't remember exactly how she phrased it, but basically like, the more of a business generalist you become, right? And so you should still be representing the unique perspective of your team, of design, of the user. But as you get further and further up there, it's more and more important to understand the sort of the data scientists and the engineers and the marketing folks, and be able to speak their language and again help piece together that full picture from all your different perspectives. So I think that was really illustrative of that, I guess that question of like, listen more, have more conversations, build relationships, and the rest should take care of itself because you're all working towards one goal.
Yeah. The perfect world where that all kind of comes together very nicely.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. I guess if we like zoomed in now a bit, like that was kind of high level, like if we zoomed into kind of day-to-day like considerations, I'm not sure, for example, like what things are like Netflix, whether you're starting to kind of head back to an office now, but I'd love to have you explain kind of like how was the remote aspect for you? How did it sort of like change your approach, if it did at all? Like how do you maintain sort of engagement and culture across the team?
Yeah, that's a good one. Remote is hard, honestly. And I think there's also a distinction between like what we've been doing for the last 2 years and true like remote work, right? Like, I think a lot of places, my teams included, are kind of moving to a hybrid model, right? Where we're like, hey, we know some people are going to be back in the office, but we're going to support remote people. I mean, I'm in Boston, and most of my team is based in Los Gatos and LA. So that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to navigate. But I think the thing that will probably catch us off guard a little bit is us thinking that like, hey, like we've been doing this for 2 years, like we're good at this, and then realizing how different that dynamic is when half the people are back in the office, and that that there is a difference between a truly remote and very strained workforce and one that's like encouraged by some positive changes and actually hybrid, right? So with remote specifically, to try to not get too off topic here, I think, you know, it has some benefits. I don't want to frame it as like remote is a challenge to be overcome. I think that was something that like we talked about early on in the pandemic, was a lot of the folks from Netflix traditionally has been like a very face-to-face culture. And so a lot of like the old guard was like, hey, when can we get back to normal? When can we get back to like the ideal face-to-face working relationship? And I think like some of the newer people or folks from different disciplines that are more remote friendly, I think we're really trying to correct that conversation and say like, hey, there's also aspects of remote that we can take advantage of and benefit from, right? So I think that's also an important distinction, to not only view remote as like this challenge, this detriment to the team, and to instead go, hey, actually, we might benefit from doing more asynchronous collaboration, right? Like, hey, we could have less face-to-face meetings, but use Loom to record like, you know, design overviews and give it to the team, and then like have comments be the way that we drive some of the feedback. Like, I think there are things to take advantage of that should exist beyond, you know, this stretch of like fully remote work. I think the other aspect of it is that it requires different skills, right? And with a lot of like what I'm talking about, like, hey, you need to like build relationships with people, like build these foundations on a personal level. That's a lot of the time made more challenging when it's fully remote, right? Like I have multiple people on my team that I hired that I've never met in person. And that's kind of wild. Like, I don't even know, like they could be 7 feet tall and I have no idea. Like I'm going to meet them for the first time and be like, oh my God, who are you? And so not having them in like 3 dimensions is challenging. So you even more so need to lean into, you know, how do we connect? Like, how do we set up, you know, opportunities for us to like build culture and trust and have fun? So, you know, I know it's not like a very specific answer, but like, it's really just paying more and more attention to that and looking for opportunities. And fortunately, a lot of our tooling is more mature than it used to be to support this, like FigJam or Miro or Loom, like I said. So really just, it's another very important thing for both the manager and the team to focus on, is like, how do we not feel incredibly disconnected in this world?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't know whether you have any examples of like things that have worked really well for you. I mean, you mentioned Loom, or whether there's anything that you'd say absolutely just stay away from that because that really didn't work. I'd love to hear that. I mean, from my experience, when the kind of COVID hit and we went into lockdown, I was at a company that freaked out a little bit, and we ended up having like 2 or 3 stand-ups a day. They were like, we need to kind of know everything. Like, this is a bit much. We need to kind of tie this back down. So I think that kind of, you've got to find that balance of like, we try, like, what's that asynchronous, what's that synchronous working, how are we checking that you're all supported and you've got what you need. But I do think, to your like last point, it's that kind of, it's not a one-way thing. And I think with management, it should never be a one-way thing, whether it's like up or down. It needs to kind of be coming in both directions. So the team needs to be kind of talking about, this is how we're feeling, this is how we're doing, and then we kind of, you need the kind of top and bottom up approach to kind of really find something that's successful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point too about like what doesn't work and like overcorrecting, like you mentioned, with like way too many stand-ups and stuff like that. I think it's also worth acknowledging that like, because this has been so long, like over the course of like 2 years now, there's been ebbs and flows of what has worked and what hasn't, right? Like at first, I think we were immediately like, oh man, I miss getting together with everyone. I miss being able to grab lunch. Like, why don't we set up a lunch hour Zoom and we'll like eat sandwiches in front of each other, right? Like, let's do that for the first couple months. And then like quickly that becomes like, wow, this is like, I would rather not be doing this, right? So like that flows over time, right? Like maybe a few months in, a happy hour sounds like a really good idea. And yeah, let's do it. And then, you know, a year and a half in, you're like, there is no line between my work and home life. And the last thing I want to do at 5 p.m. is like hop back on Zoom and hang out with coworkers. So I've been hanging out with them all day, right? So I think for us, a lot of it was that, like, kind of just acknowledging that, you know, some of the things early on to really make sure we weren't losing some of that connection ended up being too much, or you know, not what everybody needed. Like, I think we've swung back to the other end so much that like something I've been doing in my meetings is, you know, Zoom fatigue, I think is very real, right? Like people get so exhausted, you get tired, you keep looking at yourself to make sure that your hair's not like sticking up weird. Like, it's just like a difficult thing. And by the end of the day, like, you just like want to turn off and not like worry about being on and smiling perfectly for the camera. And so something I've done in like some of my team meetings is like every few instances, or every, I don't know, every 4 or whatever, I'll go, let's just not have cameras on this meeting, right? Let's just turn it off. And like, that seems like such a small thing, but people have like repeatedly mentioned to me, there's like, thank you for not having cameras on for this meeting. It's so nice to like not worry about that. Like, it's not that I'm not paying attention, but like, I can just like lounge back and like listen and talk, and like, it's totally fine, right? So I think that's been one specific tool I've really liked. And additionally, making sure that you're leaving room for fun, but not like adding a burden to people, right? So like earlier on in the pandemic, it was like, hey, let's schedule a, after work, what's one we did? Like a virtual escape room thing, right? And like, it's really fun. It's just a good way to like have fun with each other and take some screenshots that are, ridiculous, that you can share in a team deck or whatever. So if you want to do that thing at this point in the pandemic, how about let's do it like in the second half of a Friday, and like let everybody like escape work earlier and get to the weekend, right? Like, let's take time that we already are claiming, instead of adding an additional ask or a time burden for folks.
Yeah. No, I mean, that precise point came up in a meeting that we had earlier. I think that it's how do we bring people together, especially one of the things we're very cognizant of is like the hybrid, we've got some designers that are really hanging out in the office together already, and then others that were remote. And from a company culture perspective, how do we make sure that everyone's equally as part of that culture that we're building is incredibly important. I think something else to the cameras off point that like I've done before is like, I mean, it didn't really work out. I don't think people got the vibe of what I was supposed to be doing, but it was just like a go for a walk meeting, like get out of the house when you can, cameras off, just listen to it, let's chat. If you don't want to go out, walk around the house, like it doesn't really matter, just get up and do something, and let's see how we can kind of keep things kind of moving. But that's good. I do want to make sure that we're kind of getting to some of the questions that are in the chat, but one more from me, because I think it was a hot topic kind of leading up to this, is we've talked about some of the really good sides of management and how you can do it. There are kind of the downsides, which I think we need to kind of acknowledge. Like, there's the difficult sides that come up, not always fun, like the difficult conversations and I think those are some of the areas that can actually turn people off, having to give feedback, having to kind of have some not fun conversations. So just kind of quickly love to hear from you, kind of like what tips, tricks you could share around it. How do you approach those type of conversations?
Yeah, no, it's a good one, and it is like one of those necessary things. And I think where my mind goes with it is what I mentioned earlier, of like, it's important to build a foundation first, right? And have a human connection. Because at the end of the day, like, tough feedback is going to go one of two ways. Like, if we don't have a good relationship and you don't like trust that I have your best interest in mind, you're going to hear that feedback and go, wow, I'm doomed. They have it out for me. Like, they're being way too critical or whatever. But if we have established this like trust and this level of honesty that's like continuing to go, and I give you hard feedback, I think you're more likely to hear it and to say, okay, that's hard to hear, but like, I understand that perspective. And I also know that they're going to help me level up and address this feedback, right? Like, that's the other thing too, is like, you're not just throwing criticisms at someone. It is your job to empower them, to support them, to make them effective. So you're likely going to have conversations about how to address that feedback and work through it with them over time. So I know it can be really hard. It can be really scary, but if you have that, that deeper connection and that level of respect and trust, it'll hopefully make it easier, because you know that like both of you don't have it out for each other, and that you're all just trying to do what's in your best interest to do the best work of your life, really. I think one term that has like stuck with me, I don't know if anybody has read like Radical Candor by Kim Scott, but it basically like maps out, in a quadrant, if you are challenging people and if you are caring personally for the people, right? And in the top of that quadrant where you are both caring personally and challenging them directly, that's called radical candor. And that's like a really valuable thing to have with people, that directness, that honesty, and it makes people more effective. But to the left of that, I think, where you are caring personally, but not challenging someone directly, she calls it ruinous empathy, which I think is like such a good turn of phrase. And it really highlights why this sort of conversation is important, because if you just sugarcoat everything and you don't give feedback correctly, the work is going to continue to suffer. That person's not going to get better. A lot of that pain is going to land on you as a manager because you're not, leveling up your team and helping them do good work. So it is really difficult, but you just have to understand how important it is to embrace that and to know that it's not because you're the bad person, you're not the villain here. It's that like all in all, this is to get people to do the better work and to achieve more.
Absolutely. And Alan, there you go. There's another resource for you with that book.
Yeah, right.
But no, absolutely, because I think it's kind of you need that kind of two-pronged approach. And I mean, ultimately that's never going to be, that's why they're called difficult conversations. Like they're not fun necessarily conversations, but as with anything else, like the more that you do it, the more kind of comfortable. And it's just about, I think it's also just about listening rather than going in and sort of leading. It's kind of put it to them as well and kind of say, this is what I've seen, this is what I'm hearing, kind of like, what's your view on it as well, and making sure that it's not kind of coming at them, and let them have a kind of view in it as well.
Right. Well, and two other really quick thoughts with it. One is we might actually be better equipped than most people to deal with this because we've been going through critique and getting feedback on our work for so long, right? And so like maybe we can feel like this isn't super personal. And then I guess the other bit is just that, like, make sure that it doesn't feel personal and that it's a two-way channel, right? Like that's another thing as a manager that we haven't talked much about, which is you should also be welcoming feedback on how you can do better to empower your team and support them. So, it shouldn't feel like this, you're enforcing this power dynamic and you're telling them what to do and telling them where they're wrong. The feedback should go both ways, and it should be both positive and constructive and really honest. So
100%. I'm going to try and rattle through some of the questions that we've got here. So Emma has asked, what kind of personality traits do well in management? What kind of personalities might not fit into management as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, I think that, there's so many different types of managers that can be effective, that I wouldn't focus overly on this. Like I would really stay true to yourself and lean into what character traits you have that like make you special and make you good at what you do and make people like you, because that's important. But I think like in terms of some things that are maybe not great or can be warning signs, maybe it comes less down to like personality traits and more down to like motivations. Like I was saying earlier, like if you're only wanting to move into management because like you don't think you have enough control and you really want to like assert control over the product area, and like you want to make the decisions, you want to make the final decisions, like that's usually not a great leading indicator that like this is going to go well. Additionally, if it's just like I want a bigger paycheck, or I want like power over other people, those like seem like kind of like silly examples, but I think there really is an element of that motivates people to get into it and be like, I'm sick of being told what to do. I want to be the one calling the shots. And like, that's really not what management is. I think overall personality traits can vary widely. You can be like the super charismatic, bubbly personality. You can be like quiet and serious and well-spoken. There's really space for everyone, and it's also about like the makeup of the team and what they respond to. So
amazing. There is one more question from Deb, so we'll try and address that, and then we'll head out into the Slack question. So Deb's asked, how much can you expect to be restricted by the business versus end of the day, staying true to yourself?
So basically like the tension between like what the business wants out of you and what you think you're providing. Is that kind of yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for me, and again, like this is coming from a place where like maybe I've just been lucky to be in environments that support this type of debate and this type of tension. But I think like as designers, leaning into what we do well, like we're very empathetic. We try to stay very in touch with the user and really addressing like their needs specifically. And not to say that other folks, other cross-functional partners don't care about the people, but like, I think there is a difference between what will we do well as a business, like what will succeed from the business standpoint, and us providing like what will resonate with the user's standpoint. And I'm of the belief that if you do right by the users, then the rest will follow, and longer term, it will benefit the business. And that's like something I'm like actually really focused on in my current role, is like really trying to argue that and quantify these difficult to quantify things to justify that type of project. But it just speaks to why it's important to have so many different perspectives in the room, right? Like it can't all be people saying, well, if we double prices, then we're going to make more money, so ship it, right? Like there needs to be a tension there, and it can be difficult to navigate. It can lead to a lot of like debate and tension, but like, that's personally how I think of it, and how I try to make sure that we're not losing sight of the people on the other end of this thing, for the sake of the business numbers and things like that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that's given up their evening, their afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Everyone, as Ian said, we've got a bit of Zoom fatigue, but you've decided to join us anyway. So we really appreciate it. And if you're not already in the Slack, head over there now, and we'll spend a bit more time. Any other questions we'll address. But if not, have a lovely rest of the day. Have a afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and hopefully we'll see you again soon at an event.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. It's really, really fun.
Thank you.
I'll see you. Bye.
Bye.